It's fair to say that the Russian Revolution was a complicated time. It was really more of a series of coups that happened to end with the Bolsheviks in charge. And in between the collapse of the Empire and Soviet Russia, there was the short-lived Russian Republic, which tried unsuccessfully to preserve the Russian order while adapting to the changes of the modern world. This is the story of the Russian Republic. Also, hi guys, it's me. As part of an ironic 2020 throwback, I've contracted COVID, so I apologize if my voice is husky. Part 1. Background. It's impossible to understand the Russian Republic without first understanding the Russian Empire. This will be brief because it's not what the video is about, but it's important nonetheless. Russia entered the 20th century as something of a European anomaly. Unlike in Western Europe, the country had not moved away from autocracy. Although there was technically an elected parliament, the Duma, it held no actual power. It could only advise the real ruler. Nicholas II ruled as Tsar and held absolute power with no restraints. Beneath him were the nobility, also virtually unrestrained, who ruled over the peasant class in the countryside. Though the peasants had technically been freed from serfdom, in reality they were an oppressed class that was bled dry by the nobility, kept in a state of often intentional poverty to prevent rebellion. Even if the nobility had wanted to improve the lives of the peasants, Russia was so poor that the estates they ruled didn't even produce enough income to actually develop anything. It was only enough to keep the aristocracy relatively wealthy. In the cities, things are even worse. A population explosion meant that the workers were expendable for the factories, creating a massive and angry proletariat class. There was no right to strike against dangerous conditions and no compensation for being fired. This massive population, combined with no social investment and growing factories, meant that cities were also polluted by smoke, dust, and sewage. Life expectancy for a peasant in the city was as low as it was for those in the poorest villages. In summary, the Russian Empire was a backwards, oppressive, poverty-stricken autocracy whose ruling class had coated itself in opulence to mask its own corruption, cruelty, and incompetence. As Anthony Beevor succinctly stated, the only disaster which could make life even worse for the poor in Russia was a major European conflict. Part 2. A major European conflict. The First World War began in 1914, and Russia was one of the first countries to leap into action. More than 15 million Russians would be called into service to fight Germany and Austria-Hungary. This was absolutely not a noble struggle. The Russians were badly led and terribly equipped. After the Tsar himself took command of the army, things became even worse, with the army suffering frequent massive defeats at the hands of the Germans. This wasn't helped by the attitude that the army took towards the common soldiers. The officers derived from the aristocracy and often took steps that seemed to serve no other purpose than to intentionally anger the men serving under them. For example, soldiers were forbidden from seeing their wives, while officers were able to return home on leave. By 1917, the soldiers, already resentful of the government, became rebellious after years of failure. Meanwhile, in the cities, as the economy collapsed from the war and the nobility continued to live in luxury, the urban class also began organizing against the current Russian structure. Even so, despite warnings from allies and even members of the Russian government, there seemed to be a willful ignorance of the situation among Russia's leadership. Sir George Buchanan, the British ambassador to Russia, described the situation among the nobility in St. Petersburg. Every evening, it is partying until dawn. This was happening while food shortages continued to get worse. Nicholas and his family obstinately refused to accept that anything was changing in Russia. When the same ambassador suggested that the Tsar should appoint an elected official as head of the government to regain the confidence of the people, Nicholas replied, "Is it not up to my people to earn my confidence?" Conspiracy theories are also sweeping the country. The Tsarina was a German, as were many members of the aristocracy, and an easy explanation for the failure of the war was simply that Russia was being sabotaged from within. The Tsarina's relationship with the priest Rasputin further alienated the monarchy from its supporters, as they seemed to be under the influence of a crazy peasant. And in fairness, they were. This was the recipe that led to the Russian Revolution. A Tsar that was incompetent and disinterested, leading an aristocracy that was openly corrupt, while the social pressures building underneath were brought forth by the massive failure of Russia's war effort. And it finally culminated in a revolution in 1917 that caught just about everyone, including the rebels, off guard. On the 18th of February, the first of the strikes in Petrograd began. On the 22nd, the Tsar departed the city for the front line. The stage was set. Part 3. An Accidental Revolution. The revolution began on the 23rd of February, International Women's Day, when a combination of Russian suffragettes and food rioters took to the city streets in the capital of Petrograd. At this point, there was no actual organization among the protesting groups, but it was immediately clear that something was different. Something in Russia had finally cracked. The Cossack regiments in the city, meant to control the crowds, were, at best, reluctant to follow orders. The crowds continued to grow, and by the 24th, there were up to 200,000 protesters marching in the streets. At this point, the more radical elements of the crowd started chanting, "Down with the Tsar," and carrying red flags. The first of the army mutinies also began around this time. On the 26th, the Tsar, possibly not realizing the extent of the problem, ordered the army to shoot the protesters. It's not known exactly how many people died across the city, but once this had happened, there wasn't much chance of turning back. Order in the city collapsed. The garrison had mutinied and joined the protesters, and Rodzianko, the chairman of the Duma, telegraphed a message to Nicholas begging for decisive action. The situation is deteriorating. Measures must be taken immediately, because tomorrow it will be too late. The last hour is upon us when the fate of the country and the dynasty will be decided. When the Tsar received this message, he apparently remarked, "Rodzianko has again written me all kinds of nonsense, which I shall not even bother to answer." The Tsar did, however, order the Duma to be dissolved. Seeing this as an act of complete negligence, a group of 12 elected officials, under Rodzianko's leadership, then formed the Provisional Committee of Duma members for the Restoration of Order, under their own initiative. This committee had no actual power, but given that its members had been elected to the government, and at least tried to be providing some leadership in Petrograd, many soldiers and officials flocked to them, and it became known unofficially as the Provisional Government. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Petrograd, the socialists that had been released from prison during the riots formed the workers into Soviets, which means Workers' Council in case you were wondering, and then formed themselves into the Petrograd Soviet's Executive Committee. There were now two governments in the city, both of which had all but given up on the Tsar. One man, a socialist politician called Kerensky, sat on both the Soviet Executive Committee and the Provisional Government. This will be important later. Eventually, under pressure from not just the government but virtually every important military official as well, the Tsar saw the reality of the situation and agreed to resign his office. The Provisional Government was in favor of Nicholas abdicating in favor of his son Alexei, who was still a child at the time. This would have given them some time to set up an actual government with a real constitution and limits on power. The people, despite hating Nicholas, also seemed to be willing to give his son a chance. However, here, at the last possible hurdle, Nicholas still managed to somehow put his own abdication together in a way that made things even worse. Rather than abdicate in favor of his son, he chose to make his brother, Grand Duke Michael, the Tsar instead. There were a few problems with this. Firstly, it was illegal. Russian succession laws were very clear, and it was the child of the Tsar that assumed the throne, not whoever the Tsar decides. Secondly, the Provisional Government had based their policies around Alexei becoming Tsar, and not the already adult Michael. The support the Conservatives had accrued was based around a constitution being put in place. Making Michael Tsar just seemed like swapping one autocrat for another. Thirdly, Nicholas hadn't even bothered to warn Michael that he was going to be Tsar, so Michael only discovered that he was now maybe Emperor of Russia a few hours before the Provisional Government knocked on his door asking him to resign. Several members of the new government arrived at Michael's residence and explained the situation to him. The government would not support the new monarch, and also he may not even be monarch. Michael quickly agreed to give up the throne if certain conditions were met. The new government would continue to fight the war, and it would hold elections with universal suffrage within 6 months. The government agreed, and Michael issued his proclamation that same day. "I have taken the firm decision to assume the supreme power only if such be the will of our great people. Therefore, in invoking the blessing of God, I beseech all the citizens of Russia to obey the Provisional Government, which is vested with all the plenitudes of power until the Constituent Assembly, to be convened with the least possible delay by universal suffrage, direct, equal, and separate voting, shall express the will of the people by its decision on the form of government." The monarchy in Russia was dead. Also, that proclamation was written by Nabokov, whose son would later write Lolita. Not relevant at all, but an interesting connection. So that was it. That was the end of the Russian Empire, more or less. The monarchy would be formally abolished at a later date, but for practical purposes, that was it. Sort of the definition of dying with a whimper, given that the revolution really just kind of happened spontaneously and to the immense shock of everyone involved. Part 4. We've come up with something two-headed, but it's certainly no equal. As it turns out, building a country is much harder than tearing one down. The Provisional Government operated on murky authority, and their only clear objective was to hold an election. They also weren't all that popular, especially when compared to the Petrograd Soviet that existed in the same city. Due to an extreme reluctance to alienate anyone, they also freed all political prisoners and invited all foreign exiles back. Sounds good, except that a lot of these people were actual terrorists that were as hostile to democracy as they had been to the monarchy. It was the provisional government that invited Lenin, Trotsky and Stalin to Petrograd, where they immediately convened and began plotting to seize power. Meanwhile, the Executive Committee for the Soviets formed another center of power in the city and commanded the loyalty of the majority of the soldiers and workers. One of the first acts of the Soviets was to issue an order that soldiers were only to follow orders from the provisional government if they did not conflict with the orders of the Soviets. The state of confusion Russia was in was long-lasting. Even within Petrograd, exact chains of command were difficult to follow, shall we say. Outside of Petrograd, it was virtually anything goes, especially information-wise. It was weeks before Petrograd could establish real authority. The war wasn't over, but in the army, desertion was at an all-time high, and officers had lost all authority. On the front line, German aircraft dropped leaflets accusing the British of having removed the Tsar, hoping to cause instability. Having absolutely no understanding of how unpopular Nicholas had become, the commander of a British detachment of troops assisting the Russians wrote that the pamphlets rendered us heroes for several days. In the countryside, peasants quickly began forming their own committees, seizing land and rioting after seeing their landlords no longer had the backing of the state. With the split in power, Lenin entered Russia, having received transportation and financial backing from the Germans, who had hoped he would undermine Russia's war effort. Despite Lenin's Bolsheviks being an extreme minority fringe of the leftists in Russia, he quickly set to work establishing their power. The provisional government continued to rule in the months after the February Revolution, but it became quickly apparent that the goals of the mostly bourgeois ministers that ruled the country were not necessarily aligned with the overwhelming majority of the population. On the 20th of April, it was revealed that Milyukov, the foreign minister, had been secretly communicating with the Allies, promising that Russia would continue the war until the end, and still expected to seize Constantinople from the Ottomans. There were riots that lasted for days, and many members of the government, including Milyukov, resigned in disgust, now believing that the country was ungovernable. However, the Petrograd Soviet now saw an opportunity, and many of its members joined the government. This did not ease tensions. In fact, it only made the moderate socialists appear as collaborators, and the Bolsheviks under Lenin, who had previously been an extremist wing, became more popular, as the only ones willing to end the war. Kerensky moved from Minister to Justice to Minister of War, and despite being a socialist, and despite having just seen how unpopular the war was, immediately began planning a new offensive. He toured all across Russia and the front lines to inspire people for this new offensive that would bring final victory. And for a brief period, Kerensky was immensely popular and had the country convinced that a new offensive under his competent leadership was what was going to end the war once and for all. He had effectively pegged his entire popularity on achieving victory with a single attack, conducted with an army that was falling apart. I'm sure you can see where this is going. On the 16th of June, the Kerensky offensive began, even though the soldiers had been forming Soviets of their own and Bolshevik propaganda advocating the overthrow of the government was spreading among them. The offensive experienced brief success before stalling and then losing a massive amount of territory. There were tens of thousands of casualties on the Russian side and many more desertions. Kerensky, so recently having been seen as Russia's savior, was disgraced. Lenin, meanwhile, only grew in popularity as he kept to his stance of immediate peace with the Central Powers. On the 3rd of July, Bolshevik militias in Petrograd attempted to stage a coup against the Petrograd Soviet and force the Executive Committee to take complete control of Russia. Over the next 2 days, thousands of Bolshevik troops marched in the streets, along with hundreds of thousands of workers. There were large clashes on the 4th in the center of the city between leftist and government troops, but since the events of July had occurred on the initiative of soldiers rather than the Bolsheviks, it remained badly disorganized. The crowds eventually dispersed, and on the 5th, after it was revealed Lenin had been receiving funding from Germany, a warrant for his arrest was issued, and he went into hiding. The provisional government had survived yet again, just. Part 5. The Kornilov Affair. Following this narrowly avoided coup, if you thought the provisional government would come together in unity, you're wrong. On the 7th, many of the conservative members of the government resigned their positions, including the Prime Minister. This was in protest, after an autonomy deal was offered to Ukrainian nationalists that had taken the opportunity to secure independence. Even amid the revolution, the general attitude in Russia was that Ukraine was rightful Russian territory. An attitude that would never ever lead to any sort of problems ever again. Anyway, the gap allowed Kerensky to finally achieve the position of Prime Minister, despite his rapidly diminishing popularity. This came at the same moment the front collapsed completely, and for the first time the Germans seemed able to take Petrograd itself. Needing new leadership, Kerensky appointed General Kornilov as commander-in-chief of the army, as he was one of the few generals that was still popular and supportive of Kerensky. This may have been a mistake, but to be honest, the exact details of what happened next are hazy even today. What is known is that Kornilov had a great many supporters who wished he would use his new position to overthrow the government and use the army to restore order to a country that was increasingly in a state of anarchy. Whether or not this was what Kornilov himself planned to do is unknown. Kornilov attempted to introduce capital punishment to the army and have the war industries placed under the army. These suggestions were rebuked by Kerensky, who worried about upsetting the Soviets. The divide between the two men grew, and in August, Kornilov either planned to move the army into Petrograd and seize power, or move the army into Petrograd and give Kerensky the strength to actually resist the Soviet troops in the city. Either way, Kerensky believed that Kornilov was coming to seize power, and in a fit of panic removed him from his position. Upon hearing this, Kornilov apparently believed there had been a Bolshevik coup in Petrograd, as he received no prior warning. Kornilov then marched his army to the city, again either to save the government from the Soviets or to overthrow it, we don't know. In desperation, Kerensky then called on the Soviet troops to defend Petrograd and released all the socialist prisoners that had been arrested after the riots. These defenses proved unnecessary, as workers' Soviets all along the route weakened and delayed Kornilov's forces until he eventually surrendered peacefully. The Kornilov Affair was concluded by the end of August, but whatever power the provisional government had once had was now gone. It was apparent to all that the army was unreliable, and the Soviets wielded the only actual power in Petrograd. Additionally, there were now tens of thousands of armed troops in the city, all loyal to the Soviets. On the 14th of September, Lenin wrote, "All the objective conditions exist for a successful insurrection." Also, on this day Kerensky actually formally declared Russia a republic, but that was basically a formality. Part 6. An intentional revolution. Following the Kornilov Affair, the Bolsheviks grew confident that the time had come to seize power. Kerensky, now without any real ability to resist, remained so confident in his position that he made seemingly no preparations at all. He simply waited. The army units that had not fallen under Soviet control were mostly neutral, refusing to back the man who refused to take any action. On the 24th of October, Kerensky's government tried to shut down the Bolshevik newspapers that had been calling for insurrection. Instead, the Bolshevik plan to seize power was sprung. Red militias flooded the streets of Petrograd, and the few loyalist troops retreated to the Winter Palace. Early the next morning, Soviet-aligned warships sailed into the harbor and joined the coup. With virtually no support left, Kerensky fled the city. The Winter Palace was stormed later that day, and the provisional government was dissolved. The Soviets were left in charge of the city, with the Bolsheviks in the lead. It was a dramatic transformation for a party that had had only a few thousand members at the start of the year. But a mixture of luck, daring, German backing, and the incompetence of their enemies left them with the city. However, just because Petrograd had been seized didn't mean the Bolsheviks had the whole country. A brutal civil war would rage for years between the Soviet government and various rebels that coalesced into the White Movement. But that's another story. And that's basically the Russian Republic. It continued to exist on paper until January 1918, when it was transformed into Soviet Russia. But the October Revolution is where most people will just throw up their hands and declare it over with. Part 7. Legacy. The legacy of the Russian Republic is not good. It tried to tread a middle path between revolution and conservative reform, and catastrophically failed. Its leaders, much like the empire before it, were often negligent and misguided in their actions, with what people actually wanted out of the revolution being ignored. Despite being a republic, it never actually got around to holding elections. It never actually exerted power, having to share power with the Soviets. It never ended the war, despite that basically being the one universal demand. But if you have to pick one reason why it's looked back on poorly, it's because it allowed the Bolsheviks into power afterwards. It was a government whose flailing incompetence and infighting allowed what was once a group of fringe weirdos to take control of the entire country. And all the brutality and suffering that came afterwards in the Soviet Union has its roots in the failure of the Republic. It's sort of a Weimar-level government, but didn't even last long enough to have the same bright spots that Germany managed. Even after the USSR fell and a new Russian Republic emerged, it wasn't even presented as a successor to the 1917 state. The entire Russian Republic was just this strange transition period between the far more important periods of Russian history. Nevertheless, if I'm not being mean, there were some chances for the Republic to have survived. Had the Kornilov Affair not occurred, Kerensky may have had the troops to put down the Bolsheviks. Assuming this was possible, the less radical socialist groups would likely have been willing to cooperate, and some sort of coalition may have been possible. Who knows? Maybe the world could have avoided the decades of totalitarianism if the Republic had more competent leaders available. Thanks for watching.